We expect it will run a little over an hour, so we hope that you'll be able to stick with us through the hour and participate with us as well. As you may have just heard, we are recording this webinar and we will be sharing it later to all those who have registered. And we will also be editing and repurposing sections of the content. So this webinar focuses on informed consent for the use of identifiable images, specifically in the context of activity with women and gender diverse people who use drugs and other marginalised people. To make the best use of everyone's time across time zones and commitments, the presentations themselves have been pre-recorded, which allows us to focus the live session on discussion and your questions. There will be opportunities for direct interaction live and through the chat function, particularly in the concluding stages. So feel free to throw your questions into the chat and also to introduce yourself there. The webinar content, as I mentioned, will be edited and repurposed to inform current and future campaigns and other activities where images may be used in RIN projects. For example, currently, with a deadline of this Friday for activity proposals, we're leading up to the 2026 Solidarity Don't Punish campaign with a focus on women and gender diverse people. You can find details for that on the current opportunities page on the RIN website. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Anna Bunn. Anna is an associate professor with Curtin Law School and an associate investigator with the ARC Centre for Excellence for the Digital Child. Her research interests relate to privacy, torts, online harm, the digital child, and children's rights. But before we play Anna's presentation, I'd like to invite her to briefly share any opening thoughts on why this issue matters. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Ruth, and hi everyone. Great to be here. So for me, I've done a lot of research into, as Ruth mentioned, images and privacy. I guess I got interested in it when my children were quite young, and there were lots of issues with parents wanting to take photos at schools, and some parents have really objected to that. So I think the thing is, I've reflected on that images are such a potent form of communicating. I mean, we probably all know that adage, picture paints 1,000 words. And to some extent, that really is true. But we also have quite strong reactions, I think, to our own images when they're taken or shared by others. And I think we can all relate to that. Sometimes an image that someone takes of us really aligns with how we think the world sees us, and very often it really doesn't align with that. So it can provoke a strong emotional response. But for me, my background is law, and I've been interested that in Australia, where I am, a lot of people think they have more legal rights to their image than they actually often do. So that's been an area of interest for me. That's not to say there aren't legal rights in images, of course there are, and it can be quite a complex area. But when it comes down to it, I think in many ways, when we're looking at taking images of others and sharing them, to me, it is actually relatively simple. You can use, if you use sensitivity and get consent, then pretty much most of the time you're going to be okay. So I think that's what I'll share in opening, and it's great to be here. I also do have to leave for another meeting, but I've said to Ruth, if there are questions that come up after I've had to leave, very happy to take them offline and do my best to respond. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. And we'll go straight to a recording. Oh, no sound on it.
At Curtin Law. Hi everyone, my name is Anna. I'm an associate professor at Curtin Law School at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. One of the areas of research that I'm particularly interested in is laws relating to privacy and also the use of people's images. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in images is because they're such a powerful way, I think, of really conveying not just information, but also emotion. So they're a way of connecting the person watching the video or looking at an image with the people or events depicted in the image. And because images are so powerful, people tend to feel really strongly about their image and how it's used. And of course, the other thing is that an image captures a moment in time and can turn that fleeting moment into what's often a permanent record. So yes, so people feel strongly about their image naturally, and for that reason, many people even believe that the law will stop other people, strangers, say, from taking and using their image even when they're in a public place. That's true in some situations, but by and large, we don't actually, generally speaking, have many legal rights to stop other people taking and using our photos. But of course, that's not to say it's the right thing to do. And there are a number of laws that do govern what we can do with images, particularly if you're working with government or with an organisation or association. There may be laws that affect what you can do. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the different laws that exist because everybody in this webinar is in different jurisdictions and it would be impossible to do that. So I'm just going to give you some high-level pointers about some of the legal frameworks that apply, and then I'm going to talk about the three conditions or criteria for consent to be considered legally valid, again as a general rule. So I'm not going to talk about specific laws, I'm just going to make high-level statements that may or may not apply to you depending on where you are, but I will do my best to sort of generalize as much as possible. So one of the things I wanted to start by saying, and I'm not going to focus on this at all, but I think it's also worth reflecting that when when a photographer takes an image, the photographer is the person that will, generally speaking, own the intellectual property or the copyright in that image, and therefore can sort of control what's done with that image and how it's shared. And the only reason I'm mentioning that is because it's worth reflecting that this puts the photographer in quite a powerful position as regards the image subject. So it's really important to remember that that sort of power, there's some power in that very relationship. But I'm not going to focus on intellectual property laws. I just want to really talk very briefly and at high level about data protection laws. Data protection laws exist in most jurisdictions. They're sometimes known as information privacy laws or just privacy laws. And you may have heard of some of these laws. For example, in Europe, there's the General Data Protection Regulation, and in just known as the GDPR. In Australia, we have the Privacy Act. But there's lots of other data protection laws across the world, and they usually apply to government entities and private organisations, with some exceptions. And generally speaking, they don't apply to individuals when they're just acting in their personal capacity. So most data protection regimes apply to personal information, and there's specific definitions of that in the various pieces of legislation that I won't go into. But I think it's safe to assume that photographs, at least when you're showing a person's face, assume that these are personal information. Now, if you are subject to data protection laws, it doesn't mean you can't take people's images and share them. Data protection laws are really about regulating the way that those bound by the laws collect and share information. And they tend to take a principles-based approach. And a really important principle or theme is that generally when you are collecting someone's information, personal information, and wanting to use it or share it with others, that you have their consent to do so. So that you have the image subject's consent. And consent can in some situations be implied, but in other situations it must be given expressly. Without going into detail, again, I think it's probably safest to assume that whenever you're going to take a photograph or video of someone, that you actually seek their consent before doing so, and certainly before then using or on sharing that video and photo, including uploading it to the internet. So if you are subject to data protection laws, then getting express consent before taking and using an image is important. But consent goes beyond just about being compliant with data protection laws or laws at all. In some, depending on your occupation, some people are subject to ethical codes of practice. Journalists, for example, are amongst the people that are governed by ethical codes that really require them to be transparent and fair in how they collect and use information. And then if you're an organisation or an association engaged in researching with humans, you may also be subject to ethical codes that again generally require that a high level of transparency and fairness in how information about research participants is collected and used. And one of the key things about these frameworks is that they emphasize an individual's autonomy. Individuals should have the right to decide whether their information or their image is collected or indeed withheld. And that's very much part of having respect for the people we're researching with. So there may be legal rules requiring consent, there may be ethical codes of practice or ethical codes applying to research that require consent. But even if none of those things do apply to you, getting someone's consent is always best practice. Again, because images are such a powerful thing and the photographer really is in a position of power vis-a-vis the person whose image is being taken and being used. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that there have been times when images fall into the wrong hands and have been used against people, whether by malicious individuals or in some cases even by governments. And that's particularly the case if an image shows a connection or even just implies a connection with a criminalized practice such as drug use. And in some jurisdictions, even just the way a person identifies might be criminalized. So it's really important to think carefully about this. So if we know that we need consent in order to, or we should get consent before collecting and using an image, what are the three requirements for legal consent, generally speaking? What are the three requirements for consent to be valid? Now, whilst these are often legal requirements, they are also important requirements, even if you don't have to comply with laws. They're important requirements of ensuring that your consent is done in a way that does respect the individual involved. So there are really three things that we need to consider. Three requirements for consent to be considered legally valid. Again, I'm speaking quite generally, but even if you're not subject to any particular laws, these three requirements are important as a way of showing respect for the individual image subject. So the three requirements are that the consent is freely given, secondly, that it's informed, and finally, that the person giving consent has the capacity to give consent. So let me talk about each of these in turn. First of all, consent should be freely given. That means that the person who's given consent shouldn't feel coerced in any way. And thus, it's important to think about any power imbalance in the relationship, whether actual or even just perceived. It can be a really good idea then to give people some time to consider whether they do want to provide consent to have their photograph taken or used, and perhaps also some time between taking their photograph and then using it. So giving people some space to consider is good practice. Secondly, consent should be informed. And that just means that the person who's giving consent should really know what the consequences are of giving consent, and also, if any, consequences of withholding it. And this means that they really need to know how their image is going to be used, whether in the immediate future or perhaps how it might be used down the track. So it's important to give people information about this. Ideally, that information will be given to them in writing, which then allows them to go away and reflect on it. And the information should be given in as clear a way as possible. If you do give information in writing, consider also explaining it verbally to help maybe to help the person understand exactly what's involved. Make sure you avoid technical and legalistic jargon. Now, where images are going to be placed online or used in an online campaign, it's also really important that the person giving consent knows what the consequences are of an image being online. And essentially what it means is that once an image is online, it's sort of out there in the wild. It's, if you like, somewhat in the public domain. Now, that doesn't mean that another person can come along and repurpose the image for their own campaign. It's not a free-for-all, but the problem is it is very difficult to control what other people do with images they have access to. Once online, another person can copy the image, they can share it on social media, they can use it in various ways. So it is important that the image subject knows that once it's out there, you or your organisation is not going to necessarily be able to get it back. It's sort of in the wild, as I said. Now, however, the person giving consent should be able to request that you do not reuse their image later. If they change their mind about it being used in a campaign in future, then of course they must be able to state that. And it's really good practice to give someone to have a generic email address that a person can use to contact you or your organisation if they want to object to continued use or future reuses of their information. So it's good to have a generic email address because obviously people can leave organisations, so you don't want to just have it have a single point of contact. So moving on then, the final condition is capacity to consent. This just means the person is able to understand the consequences of giving consent. Usually adults, and in some cases older adolescents, usually of 15 and above, generally are considered to have capacity to consent. So I've talked about the three legal requirements for valid consent that generally exist, and as I said, these are not just important legally, they're a way of showing respect for individuals. But if you are subject to legal frameworks and data protection laws that require you to get express consent, it means it's really important to keep a record of that consent so that you can evidence that agreement should you need to down the track. And keeping evidence is good practice anyway, because if there's ever a dispute, it just allows for a clear record of what was actually agreed. Now, consent forms can be kept either as hard copies or soft copies electronically. It doesn't necessarily matter which, but I do strongly suggest that the consent forms include very limited other information. So don't bundle your consent form up with a document that gives a lot of detailed personal information about an individual. Why? Because you want the consent forms to be accessible by quite a few people, and perhaps more people than you want to have access to the detailed information about the image subject. That's because obviously, again, a particular individual or individuals might leave an association or an organisation later. We need to know that several people have access to the forms, whether they're stored in hard copy or electronically. So that's it from me, and I look forward to answering any questions during the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
That really strong start for this webinar. But look, before moving on to the next presentation, I'd really encourage anyone with us to perhaps reflect on how these legal and privacy considerations might interact with your own practices. And while we have Anna here live, perhaps if you have any questions about what that might mean for your future work with images, or any other thoughts that you might have, please feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute now. There is also, of course, as Anna said, the option to add any questions into the chat later, and if necessary, Anna can respond by email. Okay. So look, following on then from this conceptual and legal framing, I wanted to mention that through campaign and other activity, RIN have always made some effort to include reminders and tools to assist with informed consent for the use of images. And sometimes, though, along the way, we have had feedback that indicate very varied understanding or varied application of those tools, which was something that triggered this whole initiative. And so as part of that, we reached out to various colleagues with expertise in this area, including Anna, to collaborate on revamping the consent form template that we use for such activities. Where we have on screen now the current one for Solidarity Don't Punish, which I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, it includes organizational contact details, so the participant can follow up on the use of the image. And in the first instance, the most accessible organization we felt would be the one that at local level that somebody who has given consent can turn to if needs be, and they can in turn reach out to RIN with any instructions for onward use of an image. This is the second page of the form, and please note there the all-important opt-out provision. So now we'll move on to our next presentation from Molly Howells, who is the Director of Communications and Operations at AVIL, the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League. Molly has been working in drug user organizations for the past 5 years. And before that, she worked in communication roles across sexual and reproductive health, abortion care, gender equality, intimate partner violence, and family violence. Picking up from Anna's points, Molly will share a little about AVIL experience on images and consent in the context of storytelling. But Molly, before we go to the recording, could you tell us perhaps one thing most commonly misunderstood about informed consent in your experience?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And hi, everyone. Just wanted to say that I'm joining from the lands of the Yugara and Turrbal people in Magajin, Brisbane, Australia. I think one of the things we see really often, and it makes sense with what Anna's talking about in terms of it's generally a legal consideration for people, but I think we see across lots of different areas of when we're prompted to give consent, not just of images or voices, but also of our data or other privacy information, is that organizations or companies assume that they have our informed consent because they've technically given us or given a person all of the information. Maybe there's a document that has all of the information written up, generally in quite academic or jargon terms, or I think a good example is, we get a pop-up on our phone when you download an app or something like that you've got to scroll to the bottom of this pop-up before clicking I agree. giving your consent to whatever they're asking of you. Or I think another example is like a link to a web page with a list of policies. And while all of this is really good, it's good to have all of that information. I think we know that informed consent isn't just about having all of the information and then ticking that box to say that you've read it, but it's also about someone understanding that information, comprehending it, and then having the time to consider it and reflect on it, like Anna said, for their own context. And that's really a process, and it probably involves multiple people and multiple conversations. It's not just like a one task or a quick tick and flick. And that's really what I go into more detail in the recorded presentation that you're about to see.
Thanks very much, Molly. Let's move to that recording.
Hi everyone, my name's Molly. I'm the Director of Communications at ABLE, which is the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League. We all know how impactful storytelling is to us, and I think we've probably all experienced the moment when we've heard someone's story and it's really changed our perception or it's given us a deeper understanding. And stories have the power to do this in a way that facts and figures just don't. And that's because our decisions are made from our value system. You know, they're emotional way before they're logical. But we also know that there are risks to telling our stories and amplifying the stories of others, attaching images, voices, our names, or names, and these need to be considered before, during, and after a project. And that's really what I'm going to delve in today, that ongoing process of consent. Most people will be familiar with the consent form, and I believe that RIN has a template consent form that's available for download. And this is a really important part of the process of gaining informed consent from participants. It's really important record, and it's often a legal record. But I want to talk about what happens before anything is signed to start off with. When talking to potential participants about a project, it's best practice to explain the project in full. So, what's involved as a participant, who else will be involved as participants, who's working behind the scenes, who are the other stakeholders in the project, you know, is it government, is it certain funders, who else are going to be collaborators. Another important one is to talk about the overall aims of the project and what everyone involved hopes the project will achieve. I think this is important for clarity, but also so that participants can gauge whether the overall goals align with their own goals as well. Another one is to talk about what format the project will take. So will it be images in a written report, social media content that's static, or is it video? Will it be website content? Will it be a banner or a billboard? And often these days it's all of those things in many different spaces. So just being really clear about where things will go and where they'll be seen. Who the audience is for the content is another important thing to talk through. Who the audience is, but also who the audience isn't, and who might still see it anyway. And where those people are, you know, is it quite a local project, or is it national or international? All important things to clarify for people so they have a good idea of how things will work out. It's important to relay this information in different formats and formats that suit your context best, and you'll know what they are. In some situations that this might be a written campaign briefing document and a verbal conversation over the phone, or in other contexts it might be many conversations over a period of time. But importantly, we want to be relaying this information more than once and in more than one format. We also want to have conversations with potential participants about what this could mean for them. So For example, what if people in your local community see this content? Or do you have family members that you wouldn't want to see this content? Could there be any implications for you now or for you in the future? And also explaining that once content is live on the internet or even in hard copy, that you can withdraw consent and we can remove the content, but we can't guarantee that it's fully removed. And we really should consider it a permanent record. We don't know how it might have been replicated on the internet or where it's been shared to. So we can't always fully remove it. And I think that's obviously a really important thing for people to understand. We also need to, as practitioners, acknowledge the power dynamic in these situations. We might be offering someone a really exciting opportunity. And I think especially within the community of people who use drugs, we do have so many people that want to share their story because they care so deeply about community and they want to break down stigma and push for reform. But it's our duty to work alongside people to really consider if sharing their story in this context right now is the best decision for them, if it's going to be safe and what's right for them and for their local community. It's not our decision as practitioners to make, but it is our responsibility to support someone in that decision-making process. And if someone has decided to participate, they've provided their consent verbally and then, signed a consent form and you've had many conversations with them prior to that point, I'd say that's just the first part of the process. And of course, someone can still withdraw their consent at any time throughout the process. There might be situations where you've paid for a participant's travel, accommodation, you have reimbursed them for their participation in the project, their time, expertise, wisdom, knowledge, and then it comes to shoot day and they pull out. And that has to be okay. And we must support people in those situations and support that decision. And I think it's actually a testament to a facilitator that you've created an environment that people feel safe enough to pull out and not go through with something that they were feeling uncomfortable about because they had committed to the project to that specific point. They'd gotten on the train, they'd gotten on the plane, they were there, but they still felt safe to say no in that moment. I think we all know like situations and contexts can really change for people and you can't plan for these things. You might also have situations where participants see a final edit and they pull out at that point. And it might not necessarily be that they have negative feedback about the edit or the process. It might just be that at that point in time, once they see the edit, they decide that it's not the right project or time for them to be participating in something like this. And again, that has to be okay and can be supported. Just because someone signed that consent form at the beginning of the process can't mean that there is no safe exit point for them throughout the process. And I think that's probably a good segue to say that good practice would be to provide all participants with a draft of content and then an opportunity to provide feedback. And then once all participant feedback has been incorporated, to provide participants with a final edit before it goes live. And these are also really good opportunities to check in with people, see how they're feeling about the situation, and give them that buffer time to withdraw their consent if that's what's best for them. I think a practical tip around this that I learned from personal experience is just to I know money's really tight in a lot of our contexts, but to reserve some money and some time for editing at the end, so that if you do need to re-edit your project, to remove someone entirely, for example, you're not stuck in a situation where you don't have the capacity to do that and therefore no content can go live and the project falls over. It's really good if you can have that buffer. and plan for these situations. And then even once something goes live and that consent conversation, it really is ongoing. It's important to provide participants with your contact details, if they don't already have them, but also some generic contact details for your organization, so that if at any point a participant needs to withdraw consent in the future, or they just want to discuss the project with you or your colleagues, they have that pathway to do so. It's really important to keep that connection going. And just to finish out, I wanted to say that I know we're all working across the world in quite different situations on really different types of projects, and that the internet has always been a really rapidly changing space, but more so now, I think, than ever, it's changing significantly and really quickly. And I think conversations about how to do ethical storytelling and gain informed consent in the best way possible really is a live conversation, and something that will continue to evolve as the world changes around us. And I'd love to connect more with people that are working in these situations to continue these conversations as a group and to learn and grow from each other. Hi.
Thanks so much for that, Molly. And sorry for the technical glitch bits there, but I hope that was clear for everyone. Really, you've really given us a concrete sense of how informed consent works in practice. And we'd really love to hear from the people listening to this webinar, so please do share about any challenges you might have faced in your own work around these issues, and put any questions in the chat. Our final presentation is from Dr. Jamie Newland, whose work explores participatory and arts-based approaches to health justice. Jamie is a research fellow at the Asia Pacific Health Program at the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales. Her research interests focus on global health equity and justice, using qualitative methods, including participatory and arts-based research. Her work examines how health, particularly sexual and reproductive health, is shaped and experienced through factors such as intersectionality, community, and more recently, climate change. Jamie's going to give us a bit of an overview of photo voice method and consent.
Today we've been talking about images, and I thought that this was a really good opportunity to talk about a really useful method that people can think about to use if they're, going to be using images and photography as part of their reporting or their advocacy or even just engagement with community. And that method is photo voice. Photo voice was created almost 30 years ago, the first time by Wang and Burris, who were working in participatory community research. And so what I'm going to do today is just talk you through the method, talk you through some of the how to make stories from photos, and then talking about some of the privacy and consent issues in which we all need to think about, whether that's with photo voice or with just images in general. So photo voice is a term and a method. It's talking about the creation of stories through both images and narrative. Sorry, my phone is on. Let me just turn the volume off. And based within communities. It's really about promoting community-based stories and ensuring that the needs and priorities of communities are both captured and recognised and then used in advocacy with policymakers. So it has many lenses, and sorry to use that word, it's probably not ideal when I'm talking about photography, but let's go through it. So the aims of Photo Voice are to obviously enable communities to take stories that reflect their lives and then to reflect on them in terms of what that means for a specific question. So when you go into Photo Voice, you need to have a question. We call it a research question, but it really is a question. What are you asking participants who participate in Photo Voice to actually answer? The second thing, which I think is really important, and it's done in a number of ways, is the critical dialogue. So people take photographs, they create a story for themselves, but then they come together as a group and they talk about the different stories collected and created, and whether that's a lived experience that is commonly shared or quite an individual story. And then to have people actually look at the different themes that come out. So in a way, it's a community-based research tool. And the key is to reach policymakers, whether that's through exhibits or reporting or papers or media or phone calls or emails. I've always found that images are a lot easier to really traction on that emotion of people. People, even policymakers aren't emotionless. And I found reporting is a lot easier using images as well. Instead of writing a 100-page report, you can structure that down and have some really key findings, have some images, and then have some of the participant stories behind those images to really try and get to beyond what is just a narrative written on a page. So, tractioning back to the aims of Photo Voice, it is really about social justice. And I think that we all know what social justice is. So I'm not going to talk about that now. But we're talking about empowerment, we're talking about social change, but we're also talking about, giving space for people and communities to actually tell their own stories. I feel very resistant to trying to tell someone else's story. So if I can use someone else's story respectfully, um, it makes my work a lot easier. So what do? You recruit participants. How you do that is very, very different. You provide training. Now, there's a number of Photo Voice training manuals at the end in my last slide, which I think are really, really good to download and have a look, because people do it very, very differently. Photo Voice is really flexible in the way you do it. So there's some core concepts which you need to do, such as training, determining the focus and the question of the actual Photo Voice activity. Although it'd be nice just to have people do what they, to go out and do what they want to do. What I find is having the question, people still go out and do what they want to do and take what they want to do and tell the stories they want to do. But there's then a little bit more structure, which makes it easier at the NGO, the CSM, or the research level, in which to be able to consolidate this imagery and stories and which to tell a bigger story. So obviously in Photo Voice, people have to take photos. We've done that, sometimes it's just twice, half days. Sometimes the researcher or the facilitator goes with the participants. Sometimes they do it alone. That depends on where you get your cameras from. Now, a little point here is about cameras. If you want to replicate images, you're going to have to be not careful, but just think about, what if people are using mobile phones, what megapixels do they have? Is there any issues around privacy, around having photos on people's phones? We tend to buy cheap hard cameras and keep them in our offices because they give us the quality. When emailing images, when WhatsApping images, you lose quality again. So, before you do something, really think about what cameras you're going to use. So a person goes out, takes photos, answering a question that you're all trying to answer. And then they select, depending on how much time, their 3 to 5 best images. Of those 3 to 5 best images, you ask them to give them a title and to write a description. Now, with the description, I'll talk about a really, really good method and a really quick summarizing method in a little bit. Then everyone comes back together, shows their photo. So each individual presents their photo. They talk about the title, they talk about the content, they talk about the story. Then the group discusses the relevance of each photo together. Again, I think I just said it, talking about whether it's, an important issue to the group or whether it's actually just more individual. Then the group thematically sorts the issues, and the best photos out of all of the photos are selected by the group. And then you exhibit, you talk about, you share. So when asking participants to make a story about a photo, the show technique is really good, and you can use this for many, many different methods actually, and many different visual methods, but also just methods in general. So you're asking people about what do they see in the image and what is happening, how that relates to their life or our life, and whether it, is a concern or a strength or something that needs to be addressed, and more specifically, what people can do about it, what communities can do about it, or what requires change from a more systematic level. Now, these 5 questions will give you a really comprehensive story. So, images without the story. If we look at this, what do we see? We see a dog in front of a piece of corrugated iron, which is interesting, but what does it mean? Without the story, this image is just located in space and place. It hasn't got any context. But actually, when you ask the story that the participant gave says that the dog represents me. It sits at the gate and thinks about where to go. Most of the time, my parents mistreat me since I got HIV. They never want me to use their plates, their cups, their spoons, or touch any food. Because of their attitude, I always think about where I would go. The dog in the picture sits at the gate all the time wondering where to go. And I think this particular image and this particular story is quite probably on the more external. Sometimes you can actually make some assumptions about photos, about what it is and why it is. But a dog sitting in front of a fence without this narrative would not be able to tell the story. So this is where the story with the image becomes very, very important. This is another one with the transgender community in Papua New Guinea, where she brought in her bras and she said, I don't know what's gay, what's transgender, and what's bisexual, and what's all of this. I don't know all of this. Heterosexual, all of these. I don't know. I was transgender that time, but I don't know what gay and all that is. All I know is I'm a girl. I've never worn men's clothes, so I have all the ladies' clothes. A bra is important to me because I don't always have breasts. I'm always happy to dress as a girl. I want to be a girl. Now, this was collected as part of a study exploring gender and sexuality diversity in Papua New Guinea. And it wasn't just about dressing as a girl. For this participant, the bras were precious, and they were shown in such a delicate manner, with the story talking about, how they constructed and their subjectivity around gender and sexuality really brings to light how people construct themselves and talk about themselves. And I think, this was a very, very nice story with the image that went with it. And this shows how abstract some of the images can be. So without the story, again, you don't know what it is. The participant's just holding up a little plastic mirror, again from the gender and sexuality research study. And he says, yeah, it's a mirror. Why is it special to me? Because it reflects. It reflects like the mirror to others so that they can see me. It reflects like the mirror, and then they can overcome and fight against stigma and discrimination, which is when I reflect like a mirror. I was like, everybody knows it. That's I am this, and that's so that there is no stigma and discrimination anymore. Now, without the narrative behind this photo, no one would be able to hear the symbolic message in his story or know that it was actually about stigma and discrimination. But for me, this was actually one of the strongest stories. And so, having the image and the story sit together are really, really important again. I'm going to cut through this story really quickly. It was from a young man in Papua New Guinea during COVID, when we were looking at health service access and how COVID impacted health service provision and access. And he had TB. He went to the service, but he wasn't actually treated differently because of TB. It was because of COVID. And he was talking about all of the new measures in which to reduce COVID in the health service. And, it got to him and he's like, I was like this damaged vehicle in front, feeling very miserable and useless when there was no help. I needed it most. Again, this is just so symbolic. A broken down car with the tarp over it without the story just lacks context. So we've been through the individual stories of the images and the stories. Now, this is where you get photos together and you actually start to see themes. So across the many sites in the COVID study, people took photos of fences and gates and locked doors, and very, very mindful of being locked out, of being excluded. So we were able to actually use all of these photos together to tell a story about how people could not actually enter a health service during COVID. And by having these stark, really stark images of fences and people being locked behind fences, was a really easy way to engage policymakers around what people's experience was during that time. So, look, there's many photos that can be taken, there's many stories that can be developed, but Photo Voice has a particular and really important concern around photo ethics. So, I'm sure in today's session, lots have been talked about consent, getting consent from people. That consent isn't unilateral. People can actually revoke consent to photos. So what does that mean with images that are shared online? How do you revoke an image that's already out there in the universe? Photo Voice also has a section on, photographer safety. When people are out taking photos and sometimes in situations where, they could be unsafe or they could make other people unsafe. What is safety, and how does one ensure that the photographer and those photographed are actually safe? Identifying information. Because I'm a researcher, I have to ensure that there's no identifying information. We've had some really interesting experiences with journals lately, actually, where people have consented to their image and their facial image to be released, but the journal has said that we're not allowed to publish that photo, which brings in a whole other, really, really large story around, participation and consent, but something that I can't really get into here. But it's just something that we've all really got to be, concerned and quite acknowledge at the forefront. Identifying visual data has some implications, but the images also have some implications. What do we do with what happens to the metadata that lies behind these photos? Because all photos have, you know, the location, is there something in the background of the image that you can actually identify and then draw back into actually locating that person within a specific geolocation? So really, really big questions, but things that we all need to speak about. So I'm going to identify these two images to just talk about some of the visual identifying information. So obviously on the left, we have a young woman who is a beautiful young woman who consented to her image being released, but it is identifying. She wasn't a health worker or a member of a known established community, so we didn't have issues around publishing the photo in full that may have for other people. And on the right with Nelson's car, it's a damaged car, and it's something that I didn't think about until the journal article came back to me and said, actually, the number plate's visible. So we had to block out the number plate. So these are, there's lots of things in the image on the left. Is that house and that fence something you could reverse Google image search? There is there a small, identifying piece of information like a street sign or a number plate in which people can identify where, who, and why? So I think I don't know how long I've spoken for, but I've spoken a bit. So these references, excuse me, the first one is actually the first paper, the first real structural methods paper that came out. It's not a hardcore read, it's an academic paper, but it's a really nice paper in understanding where photo voice came from. I've then put in my last paper from COVID, which some of these images are in, just to see how you can use it in a formal publishing process, but then also put in a couple of manuals. So there's lots of manuals. These are my two favorite, but there could be other ones. All you got to do is put in photo voice and facilitator guide into Google, and hundreds and hundreds of resources will be available to you, and will be available in different languages. So I apologize that this has all been in English for people whose first language isn't English, and I apologize if I've spoken too fast. But I get really excited about visual imagery. And if photo voice is a bit too much, there's other things that you can do. There's a method called object biography, where if you're talking to people, you can actually get them to bring in an object that's meaningful to them in terms of the context in which you're talking about. Take an image of that object and then use that and that show technique to write a small, I hate to call it case study because it's not a case study, but to write a description against an image. And some of those methods are cost-free and can be done at any time. Maybe when you have meetings, online meetings with your community, you can ask people to bring the object, and then you can get them to take a photo and then to document it in the same way. But the outcome is that you have an image and a story, and those together are a really, really strong way to actually, to use in your work and to use for advocacy, and to be respectful of documenting, people's needs, experiences, and strengths, and all of those things that go together. So I think I probably talked too much, but I hope somewhere through all of this, something sort of went, yeah, okay, I understand that. I can do that. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend today due to a scheduling conflict. But if anyone has any questions, Ruth and Rin have my email address. So please feel free to email me. The next few weeks I'll be in Papua New Guinea, so my network may not allow me to reply automatically, but I will reply to everyone that wants to ask a question. So thank you again, Ruth and Rin. And I'm really, really, my adjectives are really bad today. I'm really grateful that Rin have put, images and privacy and consent on the agenda. I think it's a really important topic that we all need to think about, especially in a world where imagery, and curated imagery, construct our lives and how we show ourselves to the world. So glad you all attended, and I hope that everyone has a lovely day. Thank you.
Super. Big thanks to Jamie for sharing those insights, which leave us with this feeling of, realizing more, the impact of powerful images when they're associated with stories. And I think it also gives us some great ideas for how images need not be connected to a person's image or face in order to convey really potent messaging. I think it also reminds us of the importance of captioning for images. So likewise, thanks for reminding us that other images can be identifying, not just faces. Great food for thought. So now I'd like to open up for any final reflections or questions or ideas that you may have. Please do share in the chat or unmute. There, I saw that somebody did ask a question, a very good question in the chat earlier. I hope everyone saw it, and its response from Anna. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks,
Could
and I
I-
apologise, I need to leave now, Ruth. Sorry.
Thanks, Anna. Bye-bye. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a really quick follow-on comment from what Jamie said about the metadata that sits behind photos taken like on iPhones and other smartphones. And
Mm.
it's such a good point, because even if someone doesn't think there's any identifying image in a photo and they consent to it being used, that metadata can actually be quite scary. Like it will have the exact GPS locations of where the photo was taken, the time and date it was taken, and then often information about the model of phone and stuff as well, which is can lead straight back to a person. And we do some work, and our members do work around community reporting on different drugs. And so often people will send photos of like little pills or baggies and stuff, and we have to ask people to take screenshots of those photos because even though they've consented to them being shared, sometimes people don't know that that data sits behind those images, and it's an
Wow,
important thing to
super
flag.
important point. Thanks,
Uh,
thanks, Molly. So I think in the absence of any other questions, we have been running for an hour. Perhaps we'll close up now. I really want to thank Anna, who just left, Molly and Jamie for sharing their expertise today. I want to thank everyone for being here. We really hope this discussion sparks some action or ongoing action in your own work. And again, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar with you, together with some relevant links. And so please keep an eye out for that. And take care, everyone. We really appreciate your time in joining us today and look forward to staying connected. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.